Well, are we ready to talk about the subject of today?
Sure.
That's usually what Amory or Ron says.
Nice segue.
Segue is I.
Yeah.
I share that with you, Ron. I mean, Mike.
Okay, finding my poems.
Last week we looked at Blizzard and late poems.
Right.
For those who weren't here, we were a small group last week. We missed everybody. We missed everyone.
Yeah. What do you want? Anyone have one that they'd like us to look at next? Wow.
Maybe I'll throw passports out there.
Okay. Somebody want to read it?
Mike.
I think Ron can read it. I'm happy to. You want me to read it?
Sure.
All right. We save them as we save those curls, culled from our kids' first haircuts or from lovers, felled too early. Here are all of mine, safe in a file, their corners clipped, each page engraved with trips I barely remember. Why was I wandering from here to there, God only knows. And the procession of wraiths photos claiming to prove that I was me. The faces, grayish discs, the fish eyes trapped in the noon hour flash flare, with the sullen jacklet stare of a woman who's just been arrested. Sequenced, these pics are like a chart of moon phases fading to blackout, or like a mermaid doomed to appear on shore every 5 years, and each time altered to something a little more dead, skin withering in the parching air, marooned hair thinning as it dries, cursed if she smiles or cries. God, that was delightful.
Your
Last
sense
week-
of delight and mine don't align.
Last week, Anne-Marie asked us to use 1 or 2 words to describe the poems, and I used delightful, and Anne-Marie really had Bob on that one.
Being reminded that each picture I look a little more dead. It may be delightfully clever writing, but it doesn't make me feel delight.
Yeah.
I think there's a kind of there's a representative problem that she attempts to capture, and I think she succeeds. I'm surprised she doesn't mention photos and driver's licenses.
Mm.
When I show my driver's license to people at the airport, I resist because I won't joke around while I'm in line, but I resist saying to them, "So you think that looks like me?" You know?
Right.
But driver's licenses don't carry stories with them. The passports with all their stamps and visas tucked in and so on are full of stories.
Partly there's this issue about why do we keep them? And then what do they say about us? And I like the item about, I think Jacklet is for her, a jack-o'-lantern. Jacklet stare. She uses that term elsewhere.
I wondered about that.
Yeah.
But claiming to prove that I was me. There's a whole question of identity and the remembered person and the person that was captured back then as part of a whole set of activities that we undertook. But, the question, one of the questions in the poem is, how do we explain our preoccupation with these and why they matter enough to keep? And I think that's a characteristic issue in her poems.
Well, this poem reminded me of something I had to do recently because I was working at the college for 12 years as a registrar, and now I have a new job there. So I had to go out and clean out all my files. And I was just asking myself, why did I keep all of this stuff? And I ended up tossing all of it because I knew at the time it was important, being in the present, but then trying to keep all that information for historical persons of reasons that I imagine might occur that never did happen. It was kind of, it was a lift, and it made me just kind of a little bit sad, but also like kind of laugh at myself for thinking that all the stuff I was doing was so important that I had to keep files on it. I filled up quite a big recycle bin with that.
I had a very similar experience. There was a church trial in this area years ago against a lesbian pastor. Anyhow, I kept everything from that. I kept every clipping. I kept every news account. I had this wonderful collection. And when there was a change in leadership in who was going to be working with the group, I took to the new leader these carefully kept files, just so sure that she would want them. And she, who was more tech savvy than I, said, well, why would I want all these? I can find them all online. They're in order. They're sorted. They're 3-hole punched. What do you
highlighted?
Mike, do you think we keep stuff like that because we think it's important, or because we're fearful of throwing away something that we might need?
Both.
Yeah, I'd say both, for sure.
Yeah.
I think sometimes we keep stuff when we know that there's a memory or something that's attached to it, in the hopes that for some reason you'll be able to go back to that moment and relive it. We thinned out some things that we kept for Katie too for a while, because we kept every scrap of paper she brought home from classes and everything, and it was fun to go through it and just kind of, but at some point you just kind of have to move on and live back in the present without always trying to bring up the past.
Don't you think this is a conversation that won't occur, probably isn't occurring with younger people now, and won't occur 5-10 years from now?
Why?
Yeah.
We were in the workplace when all records were paper records.
Okay.
Yeah.
Or microfilm, or but we're paper records, and we just had drummed into us. We've got workplaces full of now where there is no paper.
I think the poem, though, I don't know about you, but I used to keep all kinds of stuff, correspondence. I hated to throw away letters that people had written me.
Yeah.
All kinds of photos. I have photos in boxes that are very hard for me to get rid of, and especially photos of family.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of that we depend on to help our sense of identity. And I think when we go back through them, that's a pretty deliberate process for trying to capture some sense of who we are and how we became what we are.
Well, there's also this immense trust that electronics and the internet and the cloud will be here for many years. And I think that there's some folks who wonder if it's just all going to crash one day, and that they kind of need, subconsciously, they need a paper copy in addition to a electronic copy. In my work that I do with case management, we're required to keep both a paper file of documents and meetings and contracts, and then we have to have an electronic file because during COVID, especially, because we can't always access our office. So I have mirrored files. I have electronic files and I have paper files, and they have to be identical.
You know, the title of this poem is Passports. I know you all knew that, but I'm wondering about the value of the term. We know what the passports, the purpose that they once served. But what is the purpose? I think she's raising that question about where do they take us now? What are the layers of questions that they help resolve as we look back at them?
I think it's telling that she can't remember many of the entries. Why was I in Copenhagen that particular month? So So the sadness, not the delight to me in this, that she's keeping these, but the only thing they seem to remind her of is that vague recollection of travel, certainly, but of how unfailingly wilted she looks in each one from the one before.
Well, that and the fact that she went to great expense and time to travel to a place and then doesn't seem to even remember it or why she went. I have to say, I have a bit of bitterness in my mouth about this poem. It just comes across to me as being extremely privileged. In America, it costs a lot of money for us to travel and need a passport. People don't travel anymore. It's extremely expensive. And it takes time. We only get 2 weeks off if we're lucky for vacation. So
A lot of people travel for work.
well, who cares?
They're getting paid to travel, not cost.
Well,
And for her, that would be true.
There's both.
People have to do that in a group to Tokyo and back or something. I'm talking about the luxury of traveling for pleasure and filling your passport to the point where you need another passport. It's a difficult poem for me to read. And the fact that she hates having her picture taken, I can understand that. But when she sees all those stamps and she can't remember them, the woman.
I agree with you in terms of that seems so privileged to have traveled so much to not know what it was. But I do think that Margaret Atwood would have been sent to conferences and speaking engagements, not all of which, but many of which would be a blur years later.
Well, if you watch the Hulu documentary about her, which is amazing, Mike recommended it last week and I watched it yesterday. She and her husband, her success from her books, he also was a writer, but I guess I'll say their joint success in life, they used it to travel for bird watching.
Mm-hmm.
Oh,
yeah.
That's interesting.
And I think that's great. You should celebrate your successes. I'm not a poo-poo about that. I hope I come across clear.
Emerson has a wonderful essay entitled Circles. And I recall two of those gems that you get out of Emerson's essays. One is, all our traveling is great circle sailing. And another is, we travel the world in search of the beautiful, but we find it not unless we carry it within us.
Mm-hmm.
But I think he and Thoreau wrote a lot of stuff about human beings seeking something, traveling. And again, it's a kind of false enterprise.
Ron, I agree with you. When I look at the last line and the question she asks in the third stanza, why was I wandering from there to there to there, cursed if she smiles or cries. So I think the last line really suggests that she was seeking something that travel didn't provide, or life doesn't provide.
I think there's a level of self-critique in the poem.
Mm-hmm.
Not to the extent that Shannon would be comfortable, but
it's all about my comfort, you know.
Well,
and Shannon, just so you know,
I think you should add that, Shannon, to the rationale for the podcast.
Oh, I thought you were going to say something earlier about just the title, back to the title, passports. I mean, you could break that into 2 words and just say passports, you know, so I didn't know if there was, that was something.
Yep. Mike with the insight, nice.
One of the things that I really like about her poetry, and I think it's because it's so characteristic of my own writing. I'm going to send you all a poem this week.
Oh,
and this is by way of context, it's discursive and it's so clear. And yet there's more poetic element to it than just the breaking it up into sections. So I really like that in her poetry.
I'm hoping we can get to her plastic
Let's do it.
That's good.
poem because I'm in love with that one. And, but there's more than, I think you listed one. Doesn't it have like 7?
Yeah.
Plasticene suite.
Yeah, there were 7 poems in that sequence.
But we have just rock-like object on beach, right?
We have
We had
that
a
one,
couple.
foliage and whales.
Yeah. Why don't we be thinking about whether we want to wrap on Margaret this week, or if we want to look closely enough at the poems to devote another week to her. We can think about that.
I think it's worth another week. We won't
Good.
get through all of them, and I really like her. I like looking at her poems.
Rock-like object on
Yes,
beach.
yes.
When I first read this poem, I thought I was reading something kind of playful, but it's much more heavily ironic than that. Betty, how would you like to read it?
Sure. Rock-like object on beach. The Paleocene, the Eocene, the Miocene, the Plasticene, and now we're here, the Plasticene. Look, a rock made of sand, and one of lime, and one of quartz, and one of, what is this? It's black and striped and slippery, not exactly rock and not. On the beach at any rate, petrified oil with a vein of scarlet, part of a bucket maybe. When we're gone and the aliens come to puzzle out their fossils, will this be evidence of us, of our too brief history, our cleverness, our thoughtlessness, our sudden death?
Wow.
I love she doesn't use the word microcosm, but I love the reading of a world in one artifact.
Mm-hmm.
And it's so legitimate, I think. And how much confidence does it take by a poet to write that third stanza? It's black and striped and slippery, not exactly rock and not. Wow.
I think this is an interesting one to contrast with the one that we just read with Passport, because Passport to me was more about the present time and what's important and what's not important. Now we're looking at this, the span of time here and realizing that we're living way too much in the present and short-term thinking and getting us in trouble with how we're treating the earth, and we're taking materials from it for our current, but we're not without thinking about our future.
I like the way the second part of the poem is just, well, it's the whole poem, but once she picks up the object and in the second stanza, and one of, what is this?
Mm-hmm.
And on the beach at any rate, so this kind of mulling out loud the possibilities, leading to the questions at the end.
Even though we've heard this over and over again, I think there are too many of us, myself included, that just don't count up what it means that things will never disappear. They will never decompose. They will always be in a landfill. I am grateful for the prophets like Margaret Atwood, but it's got to be really hard to know that you live with that truth and you can't catch other people's attention.
Mm.
Well, and a couple of her poems really take that issue up. Not to shift our attention to it, but foliage ends. Who plants it, this useless crop? Who harvests it? Who can say stop?
Well, about her poet, this poem too is like how I'll go back to like how she's really expansive in the beginning, and then like a microscope, she brings us down to this one piece of rock, and then she uses this non-rock to kind of be the prophet, or to kind of tell us where we're going with that, and then to lay that back on us to say, of our too brief history, our cleverness, our thoughtlessness, our sudden death. I feel like that's where it's about like, man, I really need to pay more attention to things that are going on and be more active in my understanding my impact and what I'm doing, this decisions I'm making, and of more of a long term rather than the immediate. I repeat myself on that.
And how challenging it is, because almost everything we purchase these days is wrapped in plastic.
Mm-hmm.
Having read Zero Waste Household books, I realize I'm failing every day, the process. And it's lots of it, not because I want to, it's because if I'm going to eat or purchase toilet paper, it's all in plastic, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I of course like the idea, because I had discovered Plasticene era in the poem that I submitted a while ago, and did not expect the reader to understand what I was saying if I didn't have a plastic and then a hyphen and scene. And she doesn't worry about the reader getting her point. She spells it the way she spells.
Yes. I thought about your poem when I picked this one out. Yeah.
I love this. I love the fact that we just went from Merwin to her, and they're both touching on these issues. I appreciate them.
Yeah, do you want to have the poems read, and then we can look at them? It's kind of a little body of poetry.
Okay.
Sure.
Yeah.
Ron, are you suggesting I read 3 and 7, both, at this time?
Why don't you read Foliage and I'll read Whales, because I really like whales.
Great plan. Foliage. Quote, a scrap of black plastic, the defining foliage of the oil age. Mark Cocker, Our Place. It sprouts everywhere, this foliage. Up in the trees, like mistletoe, or caught in the marshes, or blooming in the ponds like water lilies, gaudy and frilly, rippling as if alive, or washing onto the beaches, neo-seaweed of torn bags, cast wrappers, tangled rope, shredded by tides and rocks. But unlike true foliage, it's rootless and gives nothing back, not even one empty calorie. Who plants it, this useless crop? Who harvests it? Who can say stop?
Should we go ahead and read I'll read Whales?
Yeah.
Okay, we'll do them as a trio.
Good. Whales. Everyone cried when they saw it in the square blue sea of the TV, so big and sad. A mother whale carrying her child for 3 days, mourning in its death from toxic plastic. So big and sad we can hardly grasp it. How did we do this by just living in the normal way? Maneuvering our way through package and wrapping, cutting our way to our food, through the layer by layer that keeps it fresher. And doesn't everyone? What happened before? How did we ever survive with only paper and glass and tin, with hemp and leather and oilskin? But now there's a dead whale right there on the screen. So big and sad, something must be done. It will be. Will it be? Will we decide to, finally? Wow.
Yeah.
Visual connection for me between foliage and whale. I'm kind of addicted to watching the pieces you see on Facebook of animal rescues. And we see time after time dolphins and seals and whales that are just entangled in plastic debris, and luck upon humans who can cut them free and so on. But that image to me pulls those two poems together.
Well, the message is about how we're despoiling the earth and our seeming helplessness. Even though we're conscious of it, we can't stop it from happening. We can't stop ourselves from doing it. It is part of our normal. And yet, I think they're also just beautifully crafted poems.
I really appreciate her observations as a poet in seeing scraps of plastic amongst nature. When you go for a walk in the woods, it's not uncommon to find a bit of plastic there. Of course, on the beach and just around town. It pulled up thoughts for me on my heartstrings a little bit, the foliage poem, about some of my homeless poems that I've put together, and that we see a homeless person, in a sense, a bit like garbage in the corner. And that it's something we don't want to see. In general, I think as citizens, we don't want to acknowledge these things that they have to be acknowledged, that they're piling up and it's getting worse.
Well, think of how many of those people in the tent villages around our own town are covered in plastic. You know, to me, it's indicative of the fact that there would be huge starvation if we couldn't preserve the food that we have.
It puts an exclamation point to me that this is something, like Betty was saying, she needs toilet paper, but she wrapped in plastic. I can't make it at home, and that's what this globalization of products is the plastic preserves it and allows it for transport and keeps it safe.
To buy a single roll of paper, of toilet paper, that's just in its own paper wrap at the co-op is a very expensive choice. We also make it hard to.
Yeah, eating organically is more expensive than not organically. But
and paper is
I feel helpless because the change has to come from the manufacturers, and we know that they're greedy little bastards, and they won't change until somebody makes them change. And then not only that, it has to be globally changed.
As long as there's something out in the world calling it into existence, it will exist. If it isn't one manufacturer, it'll be another.
I'd say 90% of our garbage is packaging. It's.
Oh, that's true in our house. That's true for us.
Yeah.
One of the things that I really like that she does in foliage, she starts with this epigraph that is such a powerful metaphor in itself. And then she just explores it and builds on it with this sustaining the metaphor of the plant, the non-living plant, the defining foliage of the oil age. Wonderful little near rhyme there at the end of it. And then to begin, it sprouts everywhere. And second stanza, or blooming in the ponds, gaudy and frilly, or washing onto the beaches. She just has such wonderful management and control as she continues to explore the non-living plant.
Not even one empty calorie.
Yeah. The middle line in the second last stanza, unlike true foliage, it's rootless and gives nothing back. If you had to provide one line of judgment about our stamp on the earth, just so powerful. Her poems were just such a wonderful surprise for me.
Yeah.
Oh, we have a new Sean's with us.
Hey, Sean.
Finally.
Well,
I've been,
hello.
I've been trying for weeks to get my things sorted out. So sorry about my absences, because this is really enjoyable.
Okay.
Here I am for the second hour.
You showed up just in time for
Okay, I'm ready for a break.
Perfect. Well, good. At least that way I know
I'm
that
just
you didn't run away because I got here.
Quick, let's scatter. Sean's here.
Yeah.
One of the things I noticed about these poems is, how spare they are, how her language is of words that are visual, not, they're just so spare and imagistic. I know we've said that before, but such simple language. Who can say stop? You could hear that from elementary school child. That's the level of her speech, and I think it is so appropriate for what she's talking about.
I agree with that. That she doesn't use a lot of fancy words. She doesn't use a lot of words that you wonder if they're metaphor or not. It's really straightforward.
But she does use unusual words like jacklit and thrice nod. She surprises you every once in a while. There was that word furze, F-U-R-Z-E. And, it's not all accessible, but it's clad in very accessible expression. And I love that. I love that contrast.
Before we move on to anything else, I'd like to just point out in Wales, the third last section. What happened before? How did we ever survive with only paper and glass and tin? That's one age, and then moves to a previous age with hemp and leather and oilskin.
Oh, yeah.
And the selection of items are wonderfully representative, I think, of those two epics.
And also, I think it gives us direction. We can go back if we choose. Will it be? Will we decide to finally? I just very impressed with these.
Well, I don't know when we're going to break, but I want to tell you that I watched someone ski down State Street while we were talking.
It's so nice out.
And people were sledding out in the park earlier.
I couldn't remember exactly how many days in regards to the whale poem.
Yeah.
I couldn't remember how many days that the mom carried the orca baby, and it was 17 days here.
I was going to say
San
17, yeah.
I'm always kind of impressed that a poet has confidence enough to repeat a line, and she repeats that line. She uses it 3 times in the poem, so big and sad. So big and sad.
It's a simple line, but it's very persuasive the way she uses it.
Well, and especially toward the she's noting it in the beginning, and it's almost, why is she paying attention to it? Because you can't ignore it. So big and so sad. But toward the end, she suggests that it will therefore have consequence. Maybe something must be done. One of the things that is unique, I think, in her poetry is not she's the only one who does it, but she does it again and again. And I'm not sure of a grammatical term for it, but I'm thinking of them as kind of interjections, where she'll stop and say something like, do you see what I mean? And kind of directly address her listener or reader.
She doesn't let us hide, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Do you feel that she's saying humankind is responsible in the third stanza? How did we do this? By just living in the normal way, that we caused this death.
Yeah, that section is packed so big and sad we can hardly grasp it. It's just monumental. And then, but how did we do this? By just living in the normal way. That it just evolved as part of the natural, the way we go about our everyday lives.
Well,
I didn't really answer you.
That's what's scary and terrifying about it. I mean, it's one thing when something horrible happens because a single individual or a small group of somebody's goes crazy, goes berserk, and something happens. And then we can point to them and say, what happened to them? But it's much more damning to say that we all have done this every day, unthinkingly.
Mm.
Anyhow.
Hopefully
It's
reduces
poetry making
waste.
us aware.
It is poetry
Yeah.
making us aware.
Conscious.
Yeah.
And part of that is guilt. If we
Yes,
don't
it
change our
is.
behavior, guilt stands in the way. That's not such a fun emotion.
No.
So maybe it's a step.
It's a little bit of Canadian revenge on us for our American consumerism.
Could we really ever go back to paper and glass and tin, or hemp and leather and oilskin? Could we really do that?
You know, I wonder why we don't go back to glass bottles, because we could make glass and make glass and make glass, you know? And they used to wash Coke bottles and reuse them, you know, before they went to the plastic ones. And
Yeah.
if it costs a little bit more, maybe that's a good thing. But then you have the water and the electricity involved in washing the bottles, and the shipping it's heavier to ship, so it uses more energy that way. But the plastic itself is the problem. It's probably better to use energy than to put plastic in the ocean. I have a friend who worked on a ship that was trying to assess how much plastic was in the ocean in the 1980s. And it was already, the particulates of plastic were just all throughout the water. I don't know how any animals survive there at this point. It's just awful.
When I was a younger man, I used to say to my students, what will the anthropologists of the future say about us? And then while they were mulling it, I would say, they will say they smoked a lot and they chewed a lot of gum. What the hell was that about? But I mean, I had no sense of how, particularly packaging, and then the carbon fuel, etc. I mean, those weren't even issues for me at that time. Gosh.
Yes, you had much more damning answers you could have given them.
Yeah.
Well, you just made me think that, you know, when we look at what we consider ancient civilizations, we find their tools and their stoneware and stoneware like Corning, and we also find their writings on tablets and whatnot. Nobody's going to find our writings, just our junk. This is all digital, and we're not and if we print it on paper, it's not going to survive. So we don't have any. We're not going to have any historical record of what we thought in 1,000 years.
Just the lasagna dish I didn't clean.
That one.
They were lazy too. They couldn't clean their lasagna.
They ate meals heavily laden with wheat.
Yes.
I have to tell you that the company that I'm doing ghostwriting for and the books that they produce for people, they use the highest grade archival Library of Congress paper, Mohawk, that can last for their books can last for 500 years. They are all hand stitched, linen bound, perfectly done. They lie flat And that's because the belief underlying the company is that books will stick around. And so these are personal histories, memoir sorts of things. So if we're around for 500 years, so our ancestors will have these books. I just like the values that the company has. So
Mike and I had a conversation last night, and I said to him that I've just bought a new car, so I've received messages about getting an extended warranty. And at my age, I'd want to know that I had an extended warranty before I invested in it. But these questions just dwarf any issues of that kind. You know, it's gosh.
Yeah.
Her poem, and I guess we'll come back next week to her poems, but I hope we take a look at Old Children.
Yeah.
Partly, I'm just interested in how she takes on that issue. Well,
and I hope we read Dearly, since it ended up being the title for the book. So
do we want to look at Betty's poem?
And I hope we can reflect back and think, you know, now that we've gone through her poems, what are the 3 words we would use to describe her now?
I can tell you what's not on my list.
Well, what would that be, Amory?
I don't know,
next week,
dear.
we're going to save it for next week. All right.
A delightful question.